Do I have examples of when I would use color?
An example or best practice for using color so that it doesn't detract from the experience, but adds context and most intuitive.
It's a great question because remember I'm a UX and I'm an IA and I really wireframe almost all day long. And what I do is in my process, just to answer your question, is I hand off to a visual designer. So this process starts with UX. We extract requirements and do low fidelity wireframes. I do a little bit of medium fidelity, so you saw some gradients in the tab bar. But when I hand off to a visual designer who will then GUI it. And I pray every time I hand it off that he's not going to change the interaction points or put color where it shouldn't be. It's really a hard thing to manage, especially when you're handing off and you don't ever see it again. But when do I use it? I use it very sparingly and only when I want somebody to focus on that point, whether it's a CTA and I try to keep my masthead or banner area clear when possible.
One simple thing you can do when using color is just keep in mind simple things like how it makes you feel when you look at that color. Red is usually a color that signals like alert for our culture, right? For other cultures, it's something else. But a lot of times in our culture, blue is something that's very soothing. So it's kind of like, what are you trying to communicate to the person? Almost like you're having a conversation. Think of color in that context, and it might help you.
I might as well throw my hat in there as well. I do a lot of medium fidelity wireframing and mostly prototyping in Acture, plug. And I am not a visual designer. I'm a pretty mediocre visual designer, so like Adam, I'm also handing mine off as well. But I do put color into mine to try to clue to the designer which actions I think are more prominent and which I think are more secondary. And that way when the designer gets it, he or she can design certain buttons or things so that they know which ones I'm trying to draw people's eye and attention to. So I'll bring some color in for that purpose when doing medium fidelity.
Remember one thing is that when we create the blueprint, we hand to a visual designer, and then those two items are the handoffs to development. So they slice up that PSD, they take the blueprint, they use it as a spec, and then when it comes back with the code, that's the deliverable. So, yeah.
Will?
I had a question. I would imagine I'm not the only one here who is not in the UX design field right now. Okay, others. So as someone who wants to kind of break into it, but not coming from a tech background, I don't work for a software company, I don't be an engineer or anything like that right now. I'm actually in mental health. I'm a therapist and a case manager. So knowing what you know now, knowing what you know of the field, what might be your recommendations as to how would you tell yourself to get started or whatever? What advice would you give your
All I know is what I did, which I just looked at things that products I was using and things I was trying, and if I had a complaint about it or something that didn't work, then I would just go through in the process and redesign it. And I didn't know what the process was. I didn't know any of the steps to do.
Can you speak up?
Yeah. Sorry, my mic is quiet. I didn't know any of the steps or any of the process, but I would just do it. So you just pick something and you see this sucks, and then you make it better. And the practice is something that you can constantly put into your own portfolio and show to other people.
My answer to that comes a little bit from my experience watching my boyfriend learn something he'd never done before. He has a degree in fine arts. He's a software QA guy and decided he's going to learn circuitry and electronics so that he can repair vintage pinball machines. We have 17 pinball machines in our rental house, so if anybody's bored, please come over. They're all set on free play. But what the process that I watched him go through was, and he'll tell you this, he always says, get mentors and coaches. Start with people who care about you and are interested in your path and have walked that path and maybe walked it in a zigzag fashion and got it right sometimes and got it wrong sometimes, and get mentors and coaches. And that's what he does. He goes to the pinball discussion forums, and he has all these people all over the world who post their pictures of how they made the solenoid work. And so I would probably say before you jump into building a portfolio or something like that, start with someone who you can lean on, almost like a therapist for the therapist. So I would say I try to make myself available to do some mentoring and coaching. So, you can certainly try starting with me.
Good. And like Debbie, I mentor for the IXDI and the IAI. So if anybody here is looking for a mentor, I have about 4 or 5. We meet for like an hour a month or every couple months or once a year. And I'm happy to, help if you need.
So I'm actually a systems analyst for UX design, but my question is, our enterprise, our group manages over 40 internal enterprise applications. By the way, we're hiring. My question is, as much as I like, I think Joe mentioned that the modern flat design that's in vogue right now, we don't quite have a resource if that trend changes in about 2 to 3 years. Is there some sort of a timeless classic design that we can shoot for rather than following the latest trendy design? And it's based on our resource and number of applications that we manage, plus our style sheet is kind of all over the place.
Right, so you have 40 different enterprise applications, and you're looking to potentially create a single GUI layer that kind of matches them all, and you don't want to be tied to one sort of design, look and feel and have to change it over every year.
Yeah, we don't quite have the resource. Like, let's say the modern flat is out in 2-3 years, and we go into something that's a little more bubbly again. That's going to be problematic for us, and we don't have the resources to do that. So we don't want to follow the latest trend, but we don't want to be completely outdated. We want something that's kind of like timeless classic, like a leather vinyl jacket.
So maybe not material design. Maybe that'll be outdated in 3 years.
It sounds like it's kind of a visual design question more than anything, but that's fine. I think that affects the UX for sure. And the only answer, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I would say keep it simple.
Yeah, I think the best approach would be to style sheet the heck out of it, and that way when you do try to change things later, maybe you can change them a little bit more incrementally, rather than saying, oh my gosh, we're just going to redesign everything and go for the latest trend. Just see if there's small fixes you can make here and there. Like a few years ago, I remember when everyone thought Times New Roman looked the best, and who's ever going to use anything other than Times New Roman? And now everything's more in Arial, and then now we've got web fonts. So I think if you can style sheet the heck out of something, get your web fonts in there, then later on you can, hopefully with just what feels like a few keystrokes, update a web font or change a couple of colors. And so I think, and keeping it simple would be the best way. Don't put shadows on stuff, and go easy on your gradients. And I'm not a visual designer, but those are the things that I see the companies I work at, that seems to be what they're doing to try to future-proof.
And I would suggest using a platform, something like Bootstrap. They're going to be updating for years and years to come. So if you implement Bootstrap or Foundation or some type of platform or framework, then you'll always get the new updates, and they're very modifiable. That would mean you need to rebuild it all there, but if you're talking about rebuilding it all,
Is there a site, for example, I noticed that Facebook and sites like Amazon, they sort of stay away from making their sites really modern and flat for various reasons. Do you have a site or two that you guys could recommend as far as this will be a sort of classic timeless design for the next, 3 to 5 years?
I guess again I would come back to the same thing of just the more lines you can get rid of, the better. So when Joe showed the bar chart up here, that was actually the most simplistic example I've ever seen of someone just taking data and information and reducing the number of lines, so that in the end you still get the information, but you didn't have nearly as many points of data sort of like grabbing for attention from your eyeballs, right? And so I've noticed that a lot in enterprise software, and I even had to deal with that a lot in enterprise software, and just trying to remove some of, like, when you set up text, for example, you're going to create some sort of alignment. There will either be left alignment or something like that, right? That actually creates a line for your eye. You don't need an extra line on the outside of it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Are you in an agile environment?
We are for
Headed there? on the agile road? Because if so, then whoever's building the epics should probably build in some sprints for design updates, even small ones, incremental ones, even done once a year or every other year. Build in a few sprints for just some small design updates, and that way you don't look like you're 5 years behind. Then maybe you can do something a little bit, something small each year. This year we're rounding our corners. Next year we're unrounding our corners. You know, so do something small and incremental that makes you look like you're keeping up with things.
At times in enterprise UX, it seems like there's a preconception from the clients or whoever it is about what features should be in a product. Sometimes we'll then go to the users and figure out that they might not want that or might not kind of conceptualize it the same way. What's UX's role in kind of either designing around things or really kind of butting up and saying, like, when there's product requirements that might not be really on point?
User-centered design. When you go out to the user and you ask them, and you really bring them into the design process, it's a beautiful. There's a few, there's few types of design processes, but that's the best way. Ask me again. Can you ask me one more time?
I think probably a client's the best example of when you have there's preconceptions about what features and sort of a certain amount of requirements that are in the product already prior to even getting to what they might consider the UI sort of design. So what's UX's place in a scenario like that, maybe in a client-agency relationship of kind of butting up against those assumptions versus designing around it?
So I'll just say, in my experience, it's a lot of starting with, like, who is it that's going to be using this? Just asking that question of the people that in this case, it's the client for you that you're building for. So just who is it that they're designing for? And then trying to really paint a picture that's very realistic of a real person with a name and, like, a role in the organization, and how, like, then go talk to that person and how is it that they actually use the software. So if they're building for 1,000 or 5,000 of those types of people in that particular role, then now you have something to build towards, right? And you actually have, it's typically called a persona, but without putting labels on it. It's just something that you have that you can use and say, like, hey, let's remember John that we're designing for, who works in the customer service area, right? And you can kind of put a face to all of this and remind them, like, specifically what his feedback was, where his pain points were. Like, what is it that makes him take so long when he's answering a call that bothers you? You want him to have more features. He's actually overwhelmed by the number of buttons that you put on the screen. So how do you get him to what he actually needs, right? Is that helpful?
One thing about project management is you have three things that go into it. You have time, resource, scope, right? And no matter what happens there with any of those three, if you move one, the other one has to move, right? It gets smaller, gets larger. But you definitely want to make sure that in the scope portion that you get rid of nice to have features. So you get your feature list all together, and then you cross out the ones that you don't need initially. And once those are out of the way, you can actually design for the simplest solution. And then you can add them on later if you need to, but make sure you get it down to, the features down to exactly what will work, the finest set.
If I'm understanding the question correctly, it sounds almost like you're saying, what can UX do when there's a potentially difficult client who's made a bunch of assumptions about what the product needs to do, and how do you handle that? Am I hearing you correctly? So normally when I've run into that, the first thing I try to do is assess whether or not this client sees me or my team or department as a partner and an expert, or a pair of hands. Because I found that if somebody has just brought me in as, we just want you as a pair of hands. We just want you to take what this guy threw on a napkin, and we want you to make this happen, and we really don't want to hear what you think of it. Because as an agency or sometimes an internal consultant, you'll get that. And then I super pick my battles. I'll pick 10% of the battles I normally would, and I'll just go for like the really psycho crap where I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? But if they actually see me as an expert, or my team, my department as an expert, then I approach it very differently. Then I'll start out by saying, well, we're assuming that people want these features. How did you determine that they want these features? And they'll say, well, marketing took a survey. And I'll say, well, sometimes marketing surveys are sometimes accidentally skewed. Let's talk about doing some of our own user research. Let's see if we can talk to some users. Let's see if we can run some preliminary tests. Let's do some competitive analysis. Let's make sure that the features you're looking to put in here really are the ones that people want. And then we can also, hey, accidentally, we're also going to start to learn how they want them. Let's see if we can budget time and money for user research. So there's totally different approaches I take, whether I'm being treated as a pair of hands or as a valued partner with expertise. That's the short version. I could tell much longer stories.
Hey, my name is Arjun. I'm starting a company, and I wanted to find out, when e-commerce was starting out, the shopping cart was a big UX game changer. Have we seen a similar game changer in the sharing economy yet?
The sharing economy?
Yeah, for example, Airbnb, Uber. Has there been one UX element that has really kind of taken off or helped these companies really take off?
Well, Braintree created a seamless cart, and they were bought by PayPal recently. Braintree is basically what you feel every time you get into an Uber and get out. You don't actually show your card or your cash, nothing. You just get a receipt. And both, you nailed it, Airbnb, Uber, et cetera, they all use Braintree.
Are you saying outside of the transaction, is there some sort of game changer that in the sharing economy? Are you saying outside of the commerce?
I mean, that's fine. That's a great example. That's very appropriate.
Yeah, because I kind of can't think of one. Can anybody think of one? Something that they felt was really game-changing about the sharing economy. Somebody has a horse in this race, I can tell.
Location service. Oh, maybe that feature that be a game changer for the sharing.
Yeah, I would say design for trust and all the things that means. Speaking as a former member of the Airbnb design team, like, you know, kind of really thinking about how do you design for trust is like a critical part of the sharing economy.
Another might be, good, yep. Another might be deep linking. I mean, it's just another, you know, in the web for the past 20 years, we've had links from here to links to there, right? Hyperlinks. But when Google and Apple started designing their OSs, they didn't really, and their app environments, they didn't really create a way to link from the web or link from an app to an app or the web to an app. And just finally, we're actually creating a link. And so a link looks like http:// whatever, right? But in a phone, it looks like app / and then the page. And when we create a link and we actually assign a page, an app page, that link, people can go from a marketing link on the web or on your mobile device and tap on it, and it'll actually open the app and bring you to that page. And that's the next thing we're going to start experiencing. So, one example.
Now, obviously, gamification and evoking emotion, as someone mentioned earlier, it's been around in the consumer side of the solution. Trying to bring that into enterprise level. For some of our enterprise side, we want to create a similar kind of emotion. And I'm wondering, do you have any suggestions or ideas on how any gamification on how to bring that to the enterprise audience? So it's not just we want to make our application, yeah, it's functional, but it's going to be fun too. That's the big picture that we're going after.
Can we ask for an example of what your app does? Because I'm someone who doesn't believe that gamification should be brought into absolutely everything. So I'm just curious, what is this Enteprise app that you think everybody is going to have a spirit of competition and want to clobber each other to be the best?
Well, we actually, so one of the examples is that you would have to acknowledge or approve certain type of transactions at a certain time. And so one of the competition would be if you wait to the very last minute, or if you're late in turning your or approving the time sheet or approving certain transaction, you may not get any points. But someone who we can track as far when they're online, someone who can actually when they see the transactions show up on their screen, and when they actually will have a push notification, when they actually go into push notification and acknowledge the transaction right away, you get points. We're creating also a community board to anyone who has questions on the community board, rather than calling our technology service, they get points. Whoever answers that question, best answer, they get points. And it's sort of that kind of game.
I would think that the reward of putting the timesheet in is someone gets paid and they get to eat. Like, I don't know if someone who's not already approving these timesheets is going to be inspired by points when they seem to be holding people's paychecks in their hands. So I think we have to think about, as the talks earlier were saying, look back at your personas, look at this target audience and try to determine what are they motivated by. What will motivate them to approve these timesheets or to approve more timesheets in an hour than they were yesterday? And is there something, I'm not convinced everything has to be gamification, but I'm wondering, who are these people? Why are they doing it? Why are they not doing it? And maybe if we learn more about that, we'll find multiple possible solutions that may or may not include points that are turned in for, I don't know, sparkly characters. What do you get?
I wanna also point. So basically, what Debbie just said was exactly right on. Find out what motivates that person. And one thing that you said that struck me that I want to kind of hit on was you said, how do we create an emotion in someone? How do we give them a feeling of something? That's not something you can do. That's not something that we have the power over as UX designers. What we can do is we can say, what is someone feeling in this particular moment that they're completing XYZ task? So in your example, my first thought came to like laundry. Like, what do I think about when I have to do the laundry? I actually am going to feel a sense of relief at the end that now my laundry is clean. But doing the laundry is still a boring task. And turning in the timesheet is probably still a boring task. And even if I get a point at the end, like maybe that's not my incentive, right? Like, try and come back to so this question of what motivates you. My point was like coming back to this question of what motivates this particular person is the critical question for you to answer. Rather than thinking of how do you create a different emotion in them that they're not feeling right now.
There's one other area I'm seeing a lot of gamification, healthcare. So Kia's and Virgin Health, and you get together and you get the whole company and you instill this Kia's app, and everybody says, okay, I'm going to do yoga twice a week, I'm going to eat more vegetables, and they add all these things to their little to-do list for that week. And when they finish that to-do list, when they check it all off, they get points. And they have a whole point ranking system against other groups and teams, and so one area you can look at if you want good examples of it.
I remember meeting a guy at a startup event, and he said that he was trying to get people to exercise more and make more healthy choices by his app would show you like a garden. It was just a visual graphic of a garden, and the more healthy things you did, the more the garden seemed to grow and flourish. And if you made unhealthy choices or didn't get your walking in or whatever, the garden would seem to die a little bit. And he found that when people's gardens started to die, they uninstalled the app.
Go ahead.
Can you give examples of how you deal with managers and executives playing
my God. Yes, and. Literally. Yeah, that's a great idea. And let's consider some other options as well. Who else has other options? What other options do we have in the room? Bad idea zone. Let's put it up here. Yes, and is your biggest advocate in that moment.
So you're saying that somebody high in the executive level is blaming you or other designers for some sort of product failure?
They're not blaming, but people like to design.
They think that.
And they like to think they are, they have the skill.
Oh, okay, I think I hear you now. So I think another great catchphrase in addition to what she was saying was, why don't we validate that in user testing? If this shows that the users love this, of course we'll build it in. And if it's invalidated, we'll move in another direction.
Basically, she's saying bet them beers via user testing.
With agile process, it's a little bit tough.
Well, I think you have to find room in I forget what it's called. I just had agile training, and I'm already missing some of my words. But I know that there's a sprint you can do for all of your research and discovery. And so I think if you can say, well, we'll build it into that sprint for the research, and we'll just have to validate it in user testing. And I do. That's what I try to shoot for. I mean, it's hard when everybody thinks they're the designer, but that's pretty typical in a lot of places. The product manager thinks they're the designer. Sometimes the BA thinks they're the designer. Everybody thinks they have the vision. So I would probably look to my boss and ask my boss, how do you want me to fight these battles? Because according to the meetings I'm having, everybody on the planet is on the UX team. So hey, boss. I would almost ask my boss to help us plant a flag in our territory.
Can I chime in here? I'm not a designer, I'm a product manager. And yeah, I have this conversation with my company, with my designer. And at the end of the day, like all of you designers are able to break things down into smaller pieces that we don't see. And so when you're able to break it down and explain your thought process, you're able to tell us why what you're thinking is probably invalid. And that helps a lot.
That's a really good point, actually. This is part. I was being sarcastic with the yes and. There's part of it that's true, but there's also this piece of the reason people have this input and this feedback is because they have some experience in this particular sect that is relevant. And our job as the designer is to take everyone's relevant information and distill it down into what's really useful for the user.
Right, they might have great ideas. I'm not saying they don't. It's just they might have short attention spans because they are very busy, and also they have different assumptions. Every specialty has their own set of assumptions, and so that's just one example of how to bridge that gap.
Yeah, it's just been different at every company I've been in. It depends on so many things: the size of the company, the size of the UX team, how seriously the UX team is taken. So I can't say that this is the one thing that's worked every time. I've had to do it differently at each place where I've worked. So there have been places where the product managers have really been my allies, and they've had some better ideas than I've had. There have been places where the engineers had a couple of great ideas, and I'm glad I listened to them. I once saw a meeting grind to a halt when the VP of product came in and said, "Why don't we do it like this?" And then everybody was like, do we now have to do what that guy just said? And I basically, as soon as he walked out of the room, I said, we're not doing that. Everybody relax. Let's go back to where our conversation was before he came in. So I don't think there's one magic bullet here. I think that, are you okay, Airbnb person? There's no one magic bullet, and there have been jobs I've had where the product manager fought me on everything I tried to do. I remember one job, the guy just kept coming up to me and saying, "Why don't you just make it like Apple? Apple does everything right. Make it look like apples." And I said, because I can imagine the Mashable headline, "Company I won't name rips off Apple again." So I said, that's one reason why I won't do it. And finally I went to my boss. I said, what do you want me to do with that guy? And my boss took him aside and that got solved. So it's been different at each company. I can't say there's one magical way to handle this. It's so complex. We'd have to learn more about it. You might need the therapist in the front row.
Oh my gosh, therapy is so critical. I also want to, so that made me laugh and also made me remember, like, there have been some companies I've worked at that shall not be named, where the executive, the head of everything, gives everyone an idea and everyone just moves on it and never asks any questions. And that's actually sad for him, that that's the environment that he's set up, but also a really good moment for you to shine as a designer, to say, cool, so I gave you this thing. Here's this thing that you asked for. Here were some of the holes that I found in it, and here's this other thing. So it takes extra time and dedication. Here's this other thing I designed based on the holes I found, and now I've patched it for you, and it's this other thing that's actually better. And this one's based on research and feedback, et cetera, right? That's harder to do, but if you have the dedication, it's available to you.
How do you explain to an engineer the importance of design?
Give them a blueprint and with specs and. Exactly. Right.
So the engineer is similar to the exec, right? You actually have to build their trust. You can't just say, BT Dubs design is important, and so therefore take me seriously. It's just not going to work like that. You have to have conversations with them, also respect their craft, and work with them to see, like, well, here was my current best thinking on that. Let's talk it through, and let's see where we land. And if it's somewhere different, awesome. Then we just did that together, and now we both value each other. And that's how you're going to build the value of design.
I try to collaborate with engineering where I can, because then they feel like they're part of the design process. Maybe some of their ideas end up in my designs or end up influencing me, or sometimes I have to talk them out of crazy stuff. And then I find that if you're at the point where you're dealing with engineering after you've designed it, I find that they tend to want a lot of concrete instruction, but you also have to kind of tell them where they can go blurry with the lines and where they can't, because they don't tend to be as pixel perfect as some UX people and most visual designers are. And I'll sometimes get something back from an engineer where something wasn't centered correctly, or they didn't really think it had to be 15 pixels from this line. And so sometimes you have to give them a really detailed spec, as Adam is saying, and then you have to kind of let them know this is one of those areas where we really expect it to look exactly like this, which sounds silly. You almost shouldn't have to say that. This is the blueprint, follow it. But I found when I've gotten stuff back, one of the jobs I had, QA in engineering asked me to be part of QA, because they said, well, nobody knows what this looks like better than you, so will you help us QA it? And I just found what I called lazy mistakes, like they just didn't bother centering things, they didn't seem to care how many pixels away from things it was, and the visual designers were going crazy. So sometimes you just have to find a gentle way to communicate to them, we really expect it to look exactly like this, and we really don't see this as your moment to redesign it.
And that's a great question. I was actually thinking somebody would ask that before today. And I didn't really think about the answer, but I'm going to let you know my answer was that when I was doing the mental health clinic online, I mentioned I had to go out and find a developer. I didn't find a designer, I found a developer, and I was handing off wireframes to the developer every week, and he was coding up in that time in Cold Fusion this and giving it back to me, and I was testing it. And later on, so I created a relationship with a developer. I went out as a designer and found a developer I could actually work on a project with. I paid him. But then after the relationship was done, I found another developer. And she worked with me for the next 5 years on the UC projects. Every department I was in, I did the website for. I would hand it off to her. She was in Manchester, England. We never met. I don't even think we did a video chat. We just did email, 5 years. All I knew about her was she was agoraphobic and she was probably about 19. Yeah, exactly right. She'd never left the house. The perfect developer. And, yeah, and now, I work across the street at 425 at Zoom, and my developer from Wells Fargo, I worked at Wells Fargo previously for a couple of years. The developer there was incredible. I mean, he could do anything. He could do Android, he could do Java, he could do iOS, he could do, he's redoing my portfolio that was in Ajax in 2010 in Node.js right now. and he's doing it responsively. So I've got such a good relationship with him. He and I meet up, every couple of months. We meet up every week for coffee here because we work next door to each other. But to have a relationship with a developer as a designer is so important. I can't encourage you more than to go find a developer. There's enough in here and do a little side project. Just a little something. It's an app, it's a website, it's your portfolio, or hire them and manage that relationship a little bit. And might become friends, you might not, but it's really one way to, to get the answer to that question.
This is gonna come. I mean, for everyone in UX, they should just know in advance this will come up every single day. This will be one of the hardest things that you deal with, is trying to figure out how to establish this relationship and continue to have a good working relationship with your engineer. Even when you think you're doing it right, I actually had an engineer at Whistle when I was working there. Best conversation I've ever had. We went out to beers, and I remember I was being really pixel perfect about something, and he was like, "Hey, just take a minute and recognize that like we're really trying really hard, and like we might have missed that one thing in your mock or your spec, but like everything else, like we really tried hard to match up to what you asked of us." And that was like such a gift. I was so grateful that he said that to me, because it kind of gets us as designers off our high horses a little bit. Like, yeah, we designed something, but like this person is also putting in a lot of effort on what they just built for you. And they ran into issues that we have no idea what they ran into trying to build it, right? And we have no idea how late they stayed up trying to build it. So the biggest thing is like that relationship and trying to talk it through with them.
So give it up for Krista, Adam, Debbie. Give it up for these guys. They're so generous tonight.